The federal courthouse in downtown Miami, a formidable structure of concrete and glass, buzzed with an uncommon energy on that humid Tuesday morning. The air, thick with the promise of a Florida summer storm, seemed to mirror the unspoken tension that had drawn national attention to Courtroom 4B. Journalists, a restless flock of vultures in suits, jostled for position in the packed gallery, their laptops balanced precariously on knees, notepads at the ready, eager to capture every nuance of the high-profile corruption case on the docket. This wasn't just another legal battle. It was a showdown. At precisely 9 a.m., a hush fell over the room, abruptly silencing the low murmur of anticipation. Judge Edward Chen swept into the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him like storm clouds, gathering on the horizon. At 58, he moved with the rigid posture of a man who believed his position made him not just authoritative, but utterly untouchable. His wire-rimmed glasses perched on a hawkish nose, and his thin lips seemed permanently set in a disapproving line. A silent judgment passed before a single word was uttered. His reputation for ruthlessness, a whisper on the legal winds, preceded him, and every eye in the room fixed on him as he ascended to the bench. "All rise!" called the bailiff, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. A stark contrast to the earlier cacophony. As the proceedings officially began, Pam Bondi, Florida's former Attorney General, approached the podium. Immaculate in a tailored navy suit, her blonde hair framing a face that betrayed no emotion, she exuded an aura of calm professionalism that seemed to stand in stark opposition to the judge's palpable arrogance. Before she could even utter a greeting, Judge Chen's voice cut through the air, sharp and precise as a scythe. "Ms. Bondi, I see you're representing the defense today." His gaze, magnified by the wire-rimmed lenses, seemed to pierce through her. "I must say I'm surprised you've taken on such a complex case given your record." The emphasis he placed on record made the words sting, turning them from a casual observation into a deliberate public insult intended to humiliate. A ripple of tension, barely perceptible yet undeniably present, spread through the gallery. Seasoned court reporters exchanged quick, knowing glances, their fingers already hovering over their keyboards. Bondi's expression, however, remained neutral, her eyes fixed on the judge, betraying nothing. "Good morning, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady, devoid of any discernible reaction to the slight. "Yes, I am lead counsel for the defense." Chen shuffled through papers on his bench, not bothering to look up, dismissing her presence. With a show of indifference, "Let's hope you've prepared more thoroughly than in your last appearance in my courtroom. We wouldn't want another embarrassing performance." The barb landed, raw and unprovoked. Everyone present knew of the last case, where Chen had repeatedly interrupted Bondi's arguments and denied nearly every motion she filed. A public power play that had left many in the legal community uneasy. What they didn't know, however, was that Pam Bondi had spent the past 6 months preparing, not just for this case, but for this very moment. "I assure you, Your Honor, I'm fully prepared," she replied, her southern accent slightly more pronounced now, a subtle tell to those who knew her well that she was keeping her temper carefully in check, a predator holding its breath just before the strike. The courtroom was a stage, and the opening act had just begun. For the next 40 minutes, the courtroom became a crucible, with Judge Edward Chen acting as the relentless flame and Pam Bondi the unyielding metal. Chen maintained his hostile demeanor with a chilling consistency, questioning Bondi's every statement with thinly veiled contempt. Each question from the bench was less an inquiry and more a verbal assault, designed to undermine her credibility and rattle her composure. He allowed the prosecution considerable latitude, their arguments flowing unchecked while restricting Bondi's responses to clipped, almost accusatory exchanges. Every time she began to build momentum in her defense, to lay out a logical thread of argument, He found a way to interrupt, to dismiss her points with a wave of his hand or a sharp, derisive comment that echoed through the suddenly silent room. In the gallery, seasoned court reporters exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Chen's behavior crossed the line from merely stern to decidedly unprofessional, veering into territory that few had witnessed from a federal judge. Their furiously scribbled notes captured not just the words, but the acidic tone that permeated the air. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reflecting a growing unease as they noticed the blatant disparity in treatment. They were not blind to the judge's bias, and their expressions ranged from discomfort to quiet disapproval. Throughout it all, Pam Bondi maintained an almost superhuman composure. While lesser attorneys might have crumbled under Chen's relentless pressure, resorting to frustrated outbursts or defeated resignation, she responded to each barb with respectful but firm replies. Her voice, though carrying a subtle undercurrent of her southern resolve, never wavered in pitch or volume. She met Chen's piercing gaze with an unwavering focus, her face a mask of professionalism that revealed nothing of the intense intellectual and emotional battle being waged within. It was a masterclass in controlled defiance, a quiet resilience against a torrent of abuse. Those closest to her, particularly her co-counsel, could see her occasionally jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. These were not the frantic scribbles of someone overwhelmed or trying desperately to keep up with a chaotic exchange. Instead, they were deliberate, measured documentations, precise details of each inappropriate comment, each procedural overreach, each instance of biased treatment. Her pen moved with a quiet purpose, recording the unfolding judicial misconduct with the meticulous precision of a historian crafting an indictment. This was not a defense of the immediate case alone. It was the meticulous gathering of evidence for a much larger unspoken battle. As the morning session neared its conclusion, Judge Chen leaned back, his gaze falling upon Bondi over the rims of his glasses, a smirk playing on his thin lips. "We'll recess for lunch," he announced, his voice oozing condescension. "Miss Bondi, I suggest you use the time to reconsider your strategy. At this rate, your client might want to explore a plea deal." Several members of the prosecution team, encouraged by their judge's apparent victory, smirked openly, some even chuckling under their breath. Bondi simply gathered her materials with unhurried precision, her movements calm and deliberate, a stark contrast to the agitated energy that now filled the courtroom. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard clearly throughout the courtroom, cutting through the low hum of snickers and whispers. "I look forward to continuing after the recess." There was no hint of defeat, no trace of discouragement in her tone. It was a professional dismissal, a promise rather than a concession. The words hung in the air, a subtle challenge to the judge's overt mockery, a quiet assurance that the battle was far from over. As Judge Chen rose from the bench, a self-satisfied sneer still lingering on his lips, he didn't spare Pam Bondi another glance. His arrogance, thick and suffocating, blinded him to the subtle choreography unfolding around him. He didn't notice Bondi's co-counsel, a figure who had mostly remained in the background, smoothly slide a thick manila folder onto their table, a folder conspicuously stamped with federal markings that hadn't been present when the morning session began. Nor did he notice the tall, stern-faced woman who had slipped into the back row during the proceedings, her Department of Justice credentials hanging conspicuously from a lanyard around her neck, her eyes fixed with an unnerving intensity on the judge himself. The storm, unseen but potent, was gathering, but Judge Edward Chen, in his self-important bubble, couldn't perceive the dark clouds massing directly over his head. When court reconvened after lunch, the air in the room seemed heavier, charged, with an unspoken tension that made the humid Miami afternoon feel even more oppressive. The gallery had swelled considerably during the break, word having spread through the courthouse like wildfire about the morning's contentious proceedings and the extraordinary clash between the formidable judge and the composed former attorney. General, Judge Chen returned to the bench with the same imperial bearing, but now there was something almost theatrical about his disdain, a performative quality to his contempt that bordered on the grotesque. "Ms. Bondi," Chen began without preamble, his voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "I've reviewed some of your filings during the break. I must say I'm struggling to follow your legal reasoning. Perhaps you could enlighten us with your unique interpretation of precedent." A few members of the prosecution team, cueing off their judge, chuckled openly. One whispered something to his colleague, who covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a laugh, their faces reflecting a mixture of amusement and complicity. Bondi stood, smoothing her jacket, her composure unwavering. "I'd be happy to elaborate, Your Honor. The precedent established in Harrison versus Miller clearly supports our position that—" "Harrison versus Miller," Chen interrupted, his voice cutting her off mid-sentence, dripping with condescension. "Really, Miss Bondi? That case was effectively gutted by the 11th Circuit just last year. I would have expected a former state attorney general to keep up with current jurisprudence." In fact, Chen's assessment was glaringly incorrect. The case he was thinking of was Harris v. S. Millbrook, an entirely different matter, irrelevant to Bondi's argument. The mistake was glaring to any competent attorney in the room, a testament to either his ignorance or his desperate attempt to publicly shame Bondi, regardless of accuracy. But before Bondi could clarify, Chen continued his public dressing down. Emboldened by the nervous titters from the prosecution. "Perhaps in Florida, the standards for legal argument are more flexible," he sneered, prompting more barely concealed laughter. "But in my courtroom, I expect counsel to come armed with more than charm and political connections." Several reporters furiously typed on their laptops, capturing every word of the judge's increasingly inappropriate commentary. In the jury box, the jurors' expressions ranged from uncomfortable silence to openly disapproving glares. The Department of Justice observer in the back row was now taking notes with focused intensity, her pen moving with a purpose that foretold a reckoning. The ground beneath Chen's feet was beginning to crack, though he, in his arrogance, remained oblivious, still preening in the spotlight he believed was solely his. 3 hours into the afternoon session, Judge Chen's mockery had taken on an almost routine quality, a monotonous drumbeat of derision that had settled over the courtroom. Each time Pam Bondi attempted to present her defense, he found some new, insidious way to undermine her, to dismiss her points, or to belittle her intelligence. The pattern had become so predictable that a palpable weariness had settled over the courtroom. A collective sigh of exhaustion from observers forced to witness such a blatant abuse of judicial power. This oppressive atmosphere, however, was about to shatter. Finally, Bondi rose to formally present her defense's opening arguments. "Your Honor," she began, her voice taking on a new clarity and strength, a subtle steel that had been absent from her earlier, more reactive replies. "Before I continue with our defense, I'd like to address several procedural matters that have emerged during today's proceedings." Jen sighed theatrically, a performance honed by years on the bench. "Miss Bondi, we've already wasted enough time on procedural complaints unless there's something substantive." "There is, Your Honor," she interrupted, something she had not done until this precise moment. The small act of defiance, a quiet rebellion against his established dominance, created a ripple of surprise through the courtroom. Even the most jaded reporters straightened in their seats. "I would like to direct the court's attention to Judicial Canon 2AA, which states that a judge shall respect and comply with the law and shall act at all times in a manner that promotes public confidence in the integrity and impartiality of the judiciary." Chen's expression darkened, his thin lips pressing into an even tighter line. "Are you suggesting that this court has failed to uphold judicial standards, Counselor?" His voice was laced with menace, a final attempt to intimidate. "I am not merely suggesting it, Your Honor. I am formally entering into the record-documented evidence of this court's failure to do so." The prosecution team exchanged alarmed glances, their faces mirroring a sudden, dawning realization. This was clearly news to them as well. Bondi nodded to her co-counsel, Agent Rivera, who calmly removed a document from his portfolio. "We have documented 7 separate meetings between Judge Chen and Maxwell Harrington, the CEO of Gulfstream Industries, the primary beneficiary should the defendant in this case be convicted." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Bondi approached the evidence cart, her movements deliberate, and removed a thick binder. "Your Honor, I'm entering into evidence transcripts of recorded conversations between you and Mr. Harrington, in which you discuss, and I quote, ensuring the right outcome in this trial." She distributed copies to the clerk, the bewildered prosecution, and placed one before the judge himself. Chen's face had gone from pale to an ashen, sickly grey as he stared at the transcripts before him, his eyes scanning the damning words. "Additionally," Bondi continued, her voice gaining power, "we have evidence of substantial deposits made to an offshore account linked to Your Honor, each deposit occurring within 48 hours of significant rulings favorable to Gulfstream Industries or its subsidiaries." The lead prosecutor stood abruptly, a look of profound shock on his face. "Your Honor, the government had no knowledge of these allegations. We request an immediate sidebar." Chen seemed momentarily paralyzed, his eyes locked on the financial records now being distributed throughout the courtroom. Bank statements, wire transfers, and shell company documentations formed a meticulous paper trail that led directly to his chambers. From the back of the courtroom, the Department of Justice observer had been joined by 3 more individuals, all wearing the unmistakable earpieces of federal agents, their presence a silent, undeniable testament to the machinery of justice, turning its attention from the case at hand to the judge himself. The arrogant facade of Judge Edward Chen was not just cracking, it was shattering. Furthermore, Bondi's voice resonated through the stunned silence, cutting clearly through the barely restrained gasps of the onlookers. "We have evidence that Your Honor deliberately suppressed exculpatory evidence in 3 previous cases, resulting in wrongful convictions that financially benefited Gulfstream Industries and their affiliates." She gestured to her co-counsel, who activated a laptop. Connected to the courtroom's display system, on the large screen, a cascade of email exchanges between Chen and various parties appeared, their contents revealing judicial misconduct of the highest order, communications that explicitly showed deliberate obstruction of justice, a calculated perversion of the legal process. These communications were obtained through legal federal warrants as part of an ongoing corruption investigation, Bondi explained, addressing not just the court, but the reporters frantically taking notes in the gallery, ensuring every detail was captured for the public record. The jurors, who had been watching with increasing disbelief, now stared openly at Judge Chen, their expressions a mixture of horror and betrayal. One older woman in the jury box slowly shook her head, her face a stark tableau of disgust and profound disappointment. Chen finally found his voice, though it had lost all its previous authority, reduced to a hollow, sputtering sound. This is outrageous. These allegations are completely documented, verified, and corroborated by multiple sources." Bondi finished for him, her voice unwavering, a surgical scalpel dissecting his last shred of denial. "And there's more, Your Honor." She nodded to Agent Rivera, who produced a sealed envelope and handed it to the court clerk. This contains a formal request from the Department of Justice for an emergency suspension of these proceedings pending a full investigation into judicial misconduct. As the clerk delivered the envelope to Chen, the judge's hands visibly trembled, the paper fluttering like a leaf in a sudden gust of wind. The courtroom, packed to capacity, held its collective breath as the carefully constructed facade of judicial propriety crumbled before their eyes. Judge Chen fumbled with the Department of Justice envelope, his fingers clumsy as he tore it open. His face, previously ashen, now flushed with a mottled crimson that crept up from his collar, a sign of uncontrolled fury and burgeoning panic. This is procedurally irregular," he stammered, reaching for the gavel, as if its familiar weight might anchor him against the swirling chaos. "These allegations should have been filed through proper channels, not sprung in open court as some sort of publicity stunt." Pam Bondi remained standing, her posture relaxed but alert, ready for his predictable deflection. "Your Honor, we attempted to address these concerns through proper channels 3 times over the past 4 months. Each filing mysteriously disappeared from the record. After the 3rd attempt, we were left with no choice but to present our evidence in open court where it could be properly documented." She gestured toward the court reporter, whose fingers continued their relentless documentation of every word, a silent, unyielding witness to the unfolding drama. "For the record, copies of our previous filings along with delivery confirmations are included in Evidence Package B." The lead prosecutor, James Moretti, a veteran litigator, rose to his feet, his face etched with growing alarm. "Your Honor, in light of these serious allegations, the prosecution requests a recess to confer with the Department of Justice representatives present in the courtroom." Chen's eyes darted to the back of the room, where the 5 federal agents now stood, their presence an unspoken, unyielding threat. "Moreover," Bondi continued, her voice measured but with an unmistakable steel beneath her words, "this binder contains a chronological account of today's proceedings, annotated with the relevant judicial canons that we believe have been violated, as well as inconsistencies in your Honor's handling of this case compared to similar matters before this court." She methodically outlined disparities in Chen's rulings, citing case numbers, dates, and specific judgments, demonstrating a pattern of clear bias. The color gradually drained from Chen's face as he realized Bondi had been documenting his behavior not just today, but over months of meticulous preparation. "This court will not entertain unfounded accusations against," he sputtered, attempting to regain control. "These accusations are not unfounded, Your Honor," she replied, sliding another document toward the clerk. "This is a formal motion for your recusal from this case based on demonstrated bias. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 455, a judge must disqualify himself in any proceeding where his impartiality might reasonably be questioned." The Department of Justice observer had moved closer, standing with an unobstructed view. "Furthermore," Bondi continued, her rhythm unbroken, "we have reason to believe that Your Honor's impartiality in this specific case has been compromised by factors beyond the courtroom." She nodded to her associate, who distributed sealed envelopes containing information regarding undisclosed communications between Chen and parties with direct interests in the outcome of the case. For the first time that day, Judge Chen seemed genuinely rattled, his hand unsteady as he reached for his water glass. "This is highly irregular, Miss Bondi," he managed, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. "Indeed it is, Your Honor," she agreed, "almost as irregular as a federal judge meeting privately with witnesses scheduled to testify for the prosecution." A collective gasp ripped through the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, his face a mask of confusion. "Your Honor, we have no knowledge of any such meetings." The court reporter's fingers froze for a brief moment before resuming their work with renewed intensity, the quiet tapping now the loudest sound in a room holding its breath. Chen's eyes darted toward the exit, then back to Bondi, who stood calmly waiting. The power dynamic had shifted completely. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," Chen announced abruptly, his voice strained. "Miss Bondi, I expect full documentation of these serious allegations when we reconvene." When Judge Chen returned from the recess, the transformation was stark, a chilling testament to the absolute power shift that had occurred in the courtroom. His earlier swagger had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped formality that fooled no one. The gallery, already packed, had swelled even further during the break, as word spread through the courthouse that something unprecedented was unfolding in Courtroom 4B. The air crackled with a palpable anticipation, a collective holding of breath, as the final act of this judicial drama was about to unfold. "Miss Bondi," Chen said, his voice carefully controlled, devoid of its earlier venom, "you may present your evidence regarding these allegations." Bondi approached the bench, accompanied by her co-counsel, who wheeled a small cart bearing 3 large evidence boxes. The sight of them alone was enough to send a fresh wave of murmurs through the room. "Thank you, Your Honor. With the court's permission, I'd like to call as a witness Special Agent Marcus Rivera of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit." A ripple swept through the courtroom as a man in a crisp, dark suit rose from the back row and made his way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, Agent Rivera identified himself for the record, his voice clear and authoritative. "Agent Rivera," Bondi began, her voice steady and deliberate, "could you please inform the court about Investigation 23J-CC789, particularly as it relates to these proceedings?" Rivera nodded, his expression grave. "For the past 11 months, the FBI has been investigating a pattern of judicial corruption within this district. As part of that investigation, we obtained warranted surveillance of communications between Judge Edward Chen and several individuals with financial interests in cases before his court. The 5 federal agents now positioned themselves strategically, one near each exit, another near the judge's chambers. They made no move towards him, but their presence was an unspoken threat, the silent turning of the machinery of justice from the case at hand to the judge himself. I will consider these allegations," Chen stammered, his voice regaining some of its former authority through sheer force of will, though it trembled at the edges. "But I remind everyone present that accusations are not proof, and I categorically deny any suggestion of impropriety." Bondi tilted her head slightly, a subtle gesture of almost pitying amusement. "With respect, Your Honor, we aren't merely offering accusations. Agent Rivera, could you please inform the court about the status of the evidence presented?" Rivera cleared his throat, his gaze unwavering. "All evidence presented today has been authenticated by the FBI Forensic Laboratory. The financial transactions have been verified through subpoenaed bank records from 3 countries. The recorded conversations have been confirmed by voice analysis to feature Judge Chen and the other named parties. Chen's legal training finally kicked in, a survival instinct momentarily overpowering his shock. This court will take a 30-minute recess. All evidence will remain in the custody of the court clerk." As he rose to retreat to his chambers, Bondi spoke again, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "Your Honor, given the nature of the evidence, we respectfully request that federal marshals secure the evidence during the recess to ensure its integrity." The implication was clear. She didn't trust Chen not to attempt to destroy or alter the damning proof against him. The assembled reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every nuance of the unfolding drama. Chen froze, then nodded, stiffly, "So ordered." And as he disappeared through the door, the courtroom erupted into a buzz of whispered conversations. When the 30-minute recess stretched to 45 minutes with no sign of Judge Chen returning, a subtle shift occurred. The federal agents, who had been positioned at the back, now moved to strategic points near the exits and the door to the judge's chambers. The court clerk, who had returned from a whispered conversation with someone in the hallway, looked visibly shaken. At precisely 52 minutes after recess was called, the bailiff emerged from the judge's chambers, not with the usual announcement to call the court to order, but to approach the Department of Justice representatives. 5 minutes later, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. A woman in a tailored charcoal suit entered, flanked by 2 U.S. Marshals. She strode purposefully to the front, her credentials identifying her as Deputy Director Lauren Vasquez of the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs that had filled the room, "I am here to inform you that Judge Edward Chen is currently being detained pending formal charges of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, bribery, and racketeering under the RICO Act." The courtroom erupted in shocked exclamations. Several reporters bolted for the doors, racing to be the first to break the expanded story. "Furthermore," Vasquez continued, waiting for the noise to subside, "by order of the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, these proceedings are hereby suspended. The defendant's case will be reassigned to a different judge, and a full review of all cases presided over by Judge Chen in the past 5 years will be conducted." She turned to address the jury directly. "You are all dismissed with the thanks of the court. You may be recalled when this case resumes under new judicial supervision." As the jurors filed out, many casting glances of grudging respect toward Bondi, Vasquez approached the defense table. "Miss Bondi, I understand your team has additional evidence relevant to our investigation." Bondi nodded. "Yes, Director. We've compiled documentation on 17 cases showing a pattern of judicial misconduct. My office will provide complete cooperation with your investigation." The lead prosecutor, Moretti, joined them, his expression grave. "Director Vasquez, I want to state for the record that the prosecution had no knowledge of Judge Chen's activities. We'll be conducting our own internal review to ensure the integrity of our cases." A commotion at the door to the judge's chambers drew everyone's attention. 2 U.S. Marshals emerged, Judge Chen between them. The transformation was shocking. The imperious figure who had dominated the courtroom hours earlier now looked diminished, almost frail. His hands were secured in front of him with stainless steel handcuffs that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Chen's eyes, vacant with shock, briefly met Bondi's as he was led toward the side exit reserved for prisoner transfers. In that moment of silent communication, understanding dawned in his expression, the bitter realization that his downfall had been orchestrated not through luck or circumstance, but through the patient, methodical work of the woman he had so arrogantly dismissed. Bondi's face remained professional, betraying no emotion as the disgraced judge was led away. Only those closest to her might have noticed the slight squaring of her shoulders, not in triumph, but in vindication of the justice system she had served throughout her career. As Chen disappeared through the door, a court officer approached Bondi with a document requiring her signature, formal acknowledgement of the case's suspension. As she signed, camera flashes erupted from the gallery, capturing the moment that would dominate legal discussions and news cycles for months to come. The courthouse, which had witnessed countless dramas of human justice and failure, had rarely seen such a complete reversal of fortune in a single day. And as Bondi gathered her materials, preparing to face the media storm that awaited outside, the weight of what she had accomplished settled around her. Not just a victory in court, but the exposure of corruption that had poisoned the very system she had sworn to uphold. The scene outside the courthouse steps transformed into something resembling a media circus. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended, camera operators angling for the best shot of what everyone knew would be the day's defining image. They didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after the proceedings were suspended, the side door of the courthouse opened. 2 U.S. Marshals emerged, flanking Judge Edward Chen. In the harsh Florida sunlight, the handcuffs binding his wrists caught the light, sending prism-like reflections dancing across the white stone steps. Chen's face was a study in disbelief, the expression of a man whose world had imploded in the space of a few hours. His normally immaculate appearance had crumbled, his tie hung askew, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the courthouse's air conditioning. The marshals guided him firmly toward the waiting black SUV, navigating through the shouted questions and the blinding flashes of cameras. "Judge Chen, do you have any response to the corruption charges? Were you working alone, or are other judges involved? Did you target Pam Bondi specifically? Was it personal?" Chen kept his head down, offering no response to the barrage of questions. The man who had begun the day by publicly humiliating an attorney now couldn't muster the courage to face the public scrutiny he had brought upon himself. As the marshals helped Chen into the vehicle, closing the door on his disgraced career. If you found this dramatic courtroom saga compelling, make sure to like this story, share it with your friends, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling narratives like this one.